Hi everyone, thanks for joining this live session that we're doing around security of the hybrid workplace. My name is Yaniv. I'm a cybersecurity technology specialist here at Microsoft. We're going to talk today about the security of the hybrid workplace and how organizations are now moving into the hybrid workplace and what we need to do as employees and as organizations in order to secure that workplace. If you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to leave your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll answer those right after. So, when we're talking about the hybrid workplace, we really need to take a look at what the workplace looked like a couple of years ago. And when we look at that, we see that essentially 2-3 years ago, before the pandemic, we saw that users were only employees. Nowadays, we see that there are employees, but also partners, customers that have access to your environments, bots for any automation processes. What we also see is that organizations used to have managed devices. Well, right now, we do have bring your own devices policies, and of course, IoT that are becoming much more prevalent in today's workplace. We also see that we used to only have monolithic apps. Now we're looking into composite applications and public RESTful APIs that any organization essentially is using. Work used to be done only at work or at the office. Nowadays, work is from everywhere, whether it's from home, from the coffee place, from anywhere in the world. And when we're looking at attacks, we are also looking still on malware, on phishing, on brute force. But nowadays, we also see how those attackers are becoming much more sophisticated, being cloud-based, multi-vector attacks, etc. Now, these actually led us to think of how do we deal with this new reality and how this new reality actually intensifies the security challenges that each one of us is actually being dealt with. And so when we talk about cybersecurity, we always talk about the balance between the operational resiliency or the productivity of the organization, which really the productivity is what drives the trend towards the hybrid workplace. But also, we need to look at the security. How do we balance that productivity with securing all of our environments? And so we try to map this out on kind of a trend line. And what we see is that we start with, of course, the users. We want to empower all the users for hybrid work, to be able to work from anywhere, essentially. But of course, this creates kind of a diversity of users. As we mentioned before, we have users that are not only employees, but also partners and customers. And we also see a diversity in endpoints, multiple endpoints with bring your own device policies, as well as very diverse platforms, operating systems, organizations that are moving into the cloud, but still have the on-premise infrastructure. All of those things need to be protected against threats. What we also see is that the environments, as they become more complex, I've mentioned the on-premise and the cloud environments, as well as multi-cloud, clients using multiple cloud providers. Those also create a lot of new threats and new vulnerabilities that we need to take into account and be able to secure. We can also see how the hybrid workplace actually creates kind of a gap that becomes larger and larger between IT and security teams. We want to be able to enforce security policies across the organization and be able to do it fast. We still see inconsistency in that area. So think of patching that takes quite a while to be implemented. Those are the things that we need to think about when we are looking into the new security challenges. And taking all of these into account, what we essentially conclude is that we need kind of a new framework to build on. And that new framework is the Zero Trust framework. That's the vision that we drive forward in order to secure the modern workplace and the hybrid workplace. Just to give you a bit of data on how this looks in numbers. So a staggering number is that 81% of enterprises that we surveyed are already beginning to move towards the hybrid workplace. And this trend, of course, is only going to increase throughout time. What we also see is that when we're looking at the attacks, we see a large increase in the past couple of years with both phishing attacks and ransomware attacks. And those type of attacks are actually preventable because phishing attacks are essentially, I think, still the most prevalent way of attackers to get into your organization's environment. But it is quite easy to prevent with good awareness and good training of your employees. What we also see is that we have an impact on the lead time for response to any breach that is happening. Of course, it makes sense. If half of your employees are working from home or working remotely from anywhere, it does take time, longer time, to respond to any breach that might happen. We want to, of course, reduce that time and be able to detect the breach as soon as possible and respond to it as soon as possible. Now, I've mentioned the Zero Trust framework. And Zero Trust is nothing new. It is a security framework that has been here for years. But we now see that organizations are understanding that framework more and more and understanding that they need to accept that framework and be able to implement it. Now, Zero Trust is built on three main pillars: verifying explicitly, using least privileged access, and assuming breach at all times. With verifying explicitly, what we want to be able to do is to explicitly verify the identities that are trying to log in to your environment. That means taking advantage of all of the data points that we have, whether it's the user's identity, the location from where they're logging in from, the device that they're logging in from, and of course, any anomalies in the behavior, something that we don't usually see. When we're talking about using least privileged access, we're talking about giving our users just-in-time access and just enough access. Nothing more, nothing less. And really, the important thing here is removing any standing access that employees might have. So think of a user that has their password compromised. Of course, that user only is reaching their own work, their own files, doesn't have any administrative rights. The impact of a breach like that would be much less than if they did have admin rights. That is what we're trying to limit with using least privileged access. And finally, assuming breach. This is really around the threat protection and being sure that we are protected at all times. This means that when we're looking at network, we're looking into microsegmentation. We want to encrypt any data end-to-end to make sure that even if a breach is happening, we are able to go out there with a minimum impact. Now, the Microsoft Zero Trust is really a proactive approach that we see all across our products. And we're trying to continuously verify every transaction, assert least privilege in any one of our products and our vision, and rely on all of the data points and the threat intelligence that we have in order to be able to give those signals and give that data back to detect any breaches. Now, Zero Trust is across securing our estate. And that means it's across all of these 6 entities that you see right here. So it starts with identities, really about verifying who the user is, making sure that they are who they claim they are, and making sure that they can log in securely. When we're talking about endpoints, we're really looking into the devices that an organization is using. So we want to be able to monitor whatever is going in within the device itself, the device health, any unusual behavior that is coming in, any anomalies that we can detect. When we're talking about applications, it could be still legacy on-prem applications, but it could also be modern SaaS applications. All of that we need to verify explicitly and make sure the access to those applications is secure, and that any data that is coming in between those applications and the users is secure as well. Infrastructure. We want to be able to make sure that all of our infrastructure is hardened, that we have the right updates, and that everything is configured correctly through our policies. Network. I've mentioned that prior to that. Microsegmentation, looking into any network communication that is happening, whether it's a private or a public network. And finally, data, which is really the core of what we're trying to protect. That's where we want to be able to label, classify, and encrypt any data that we have. With those 6 pillars, of course, we have the threat protection that covers all of these 6 pillars. We're trying to protect against threat throughout those entities. And also governance, which is the way to manage the protection of all of these entities, making sure that the workflows are working correctly and we have the right and the safe governance to manage those. Now, just to give you a look of how the architecture is actually built of Zero Trust. So you see here in the middle, we have the Zero Trust policy. This is really the core of the Zero Trust framework. We want to be able to evaluate all of the signals that are coming in and be able to enforce that policy, whether it's identities or endpoints or any data that is sending requests. All of those need to be evaluated based on the Zero Trust policy. And of course, then the Zero Trust policy needs to be enforced. What we also see is that the optimization of the policy is also a key part of the framework. So we want to be able to continuously monitor the governance, the compliance, but also the security posture of your organization. How secure is your environment? All of these are feeding into the Zero Trust policy, making sure it is optimized and that it works in the best way possible. And of course, at the bottom, we have the threat protection. This is where we're trying to continuously assess for risks that are coming in. We want to fit in the threat intelligence to make sure that we have the forensics data, to make sure that we have our environment protected and continuously monitored. And of course, all across the sides, you can see the 6 pillars that we've discussed. So we have the identities, the endpoints, the data, the network, the applications, and the infrastructure. All of these trying to send requests, making sure that all of these go through the Zero Trust policy. To give you a glimpse of how the Microsoft products are actually mapped into the Zero Trust security policy. So we see the different products of Microsoft. It starts with identities, with Azure Active Directory as kind of the bedrock of the authentication part of things. We also see at the endpoints, we see the Microsoft Endpoint Manager, which is enabling you to manage your endpoints, as well as Defender for Endpoint, which protects all of your endpoints, whether it's across enterprise devices or servers. And of course, we can see all of the other products. So Defender for Cloud for defending against or protecting your cloud infrastructure. We have Azure Security to protect anything that is in Azure. And of course, Defender for Office for anything related to your data, whether it's files or email. Now, we've talked about zero trust in kind of the organizational context, but I'd like to dive deeper into that and see how you as an employee can also make a change and drive your organization to be much more secure. So we start with MFA, or multi-factor authentication. This is really the basis of security, of what we recommend as really a security best practice. And we say that because we see that 99.9% of all identity-related attacks are actually preventable through using multi-factor authentication. And when we're saying multi-factor authentication, what we mean is that we can try to log in to an application or to your device, and we are able to verify it in 2 steps. So first is a password or a biometric or a face recognition like Windows Hello. And the second step would be through the application. For example, the Microsoft Authenticator, where you essentially get a number that you need to verify, or through a text message, a voice message, or a push notification. We really recommend also moving into passwordless. We see how this really protects our users. Essentially, because you don't need to remember your password anymore, you can rely on face recognition technologies or biometric technologies. And of course, you can also use security keys. The second step of this is protecting your resources with conditional access. What we mean by that is gathering all of the signals that we can when the authentication happens. That means we want to know who the user is. We want to know the location of the user. Where are they logging in from? We want to know what is the application that they are using, that they want to log into. But we also want to see what is the device that they're logging in from. And of course, any real-time risks. So any behavioral heuristics that we might detect there. All of these come into the conditional access policy. So the conditional access policy can actually look into those signals and see whether we can allow access, or we need further steps like requiring multi-factor authentication or limiting access altogether. Perhaps password reset is required in those cases. After the policy has made those steps, then we can log in securely into the apps and the data. Now think of a use case, for example, of a user that usually logs in from the US, but now is on a trip to China and is trying to log in into their email, for example. That is a signal that will trigger the conditional access policy. Because the user isn't logging in on a regular basis from China, this is a red flag for the conditional access policy. And of course, that's exactly what we want to do. So in that case, it might require a further MFA or a password reset. Now, moving a step further, what we also see and we want to empower organizations to do is to enable their employees to manage their own identities. What this means is that it essentially means that employees are really becoming the first line of defense. And of course, this also relates to what we talked about around balancing the productivity on the one hand side and managing the security on the other side. What this enables us when we allow users, for example, to reset the password as a self-service, they can do it on their own, or they can detect and, of course, report any risky signings or any behavior that is unusual. We essentially enable those employees to be more aware into the security challenges and into the security risks. And that's essentially what we want. Whether it's frontline workers or back office employees, we really want everybody to become that security-aware person to be able to protect their organization better. Now, one more thing that I'd like to touch on, and this is essentially around the email protection, because we talked quite extensively on how phishing attacks are becoming much more prevalent in today's world. And those phishing attacks are actually preventable. How are they preventable? Mainly through good awareness of employees, being aware of what are the emails that are coming in. And of course, Microsoft can help with that as well. So when we talk about email protection and email security in general, we really focus on the Microsoft Defender for Office 365. So the Microsoft Defender for Office is built on those 6 pillars, from prevention to detection, to investigating and hunting any malicious emails that are coming in, responding to any attacks that are already happening, and of course, looking into the awareness and training of the users and making sure that there is a secure posture around the environment. Now we'll start with how Microsoft sees and tries to tackle any phishing emails that are coming in. This is, of course, in the prevention stage. So the way Microsoft sees this is through a multi-layered protection stack. We essentially see 4 different layers of protection. And in each one of these layers, we want to be able to stop the attack at this level. We start with the edge protection. This is where we're looking at the network. So we're looking into any domain reputation, any IP reputation. Whether the IP looks suspicious or the domain looks suspicious, that's where we want to block the malicious email that is coming in. If the attacker is actually able to go in and proceed after that layer, we're looking into sender intelligence. So we really want to dive into who the sender is. Whether they are, for example, sending bulk emails, that's a trigger that we want to detect at this point. After that, we have the content filtering. So after we looked into the edge of the network, after we looked into the sender itself, we want to look into what is the content that is actually have been in the email itself. Is it safe? Are there any malicious files that are coming in? Are there any malicious links that might be attached to the email? And finally, and I think this is really one of the most powerful capabilities, is the post-delivery protection. In a lot of cases these days, what we see is that, for example, attackers will send a benign link within the email, and they will weaponize it right after the link has been clicked. This really makes it harder to detect at any of the first layers. What we try to do is that at the time of click on the link, we detonate that link, and we make sure that that link is safe to be used. We also, at that layer, are looking into any of the Office stack. So not only email, but also Teams or any of the Office applications. I've mentioned this briefly. This is around the awareness and training of employees. I think phishing emails, even though they're one of the most prevalent ways of getting into the environment and actually proceeding with the attack, this is also one of the ways that we can actually prevent those type of attacks. So what we're trying to do with Defender for Office is we're trying to enable organizations to have more training to their employees and more awareness for their employees to be able to detect emails that are malicious. And how do we do that? So one of the things that we have is the simulation, that we can launch simulated attacks or simulated phishing email attacks into your environment. Those emails are, of course, not malicious, but this gives us and the organization itself the data that they need on how many users actually have clicked the malicious email, how many users have actually were able to detect the email. And of course, this gives the experience to the user to learn. So it gives the learning experience for the users. So think of a malicious email that is sent through that simulated campaign. If a user is clicking on the malicious link that was in the email or is downloading the file that was attached into that email, we see exactly what the screen shows. So we see that the user actually clicked on it. They did fall in the trap of the malicious email, but they can learn from it. And they can be promoted to go into learning and be able to detect the malicious emails when they actually come in next time. What it also gives us is it gives organization the detailed reporting and insights into those campaigns. So as I mentioned, they can see which are the users that actually did not identify the emails and clicked on the malicious links. They can also see which are the users that were able to detect and how they were able to detect those malicious emails. It also gives a good indication over time to how secure and how aware are your employees. So think of launching this type of simulation once a year or twice a year. Looking at this over time can really see how your organization progresses in terms of security awareness. And finally, it also provides the native experience to foster that user awareness. So think of suspicious emails that are coming in. Suspicious emails are usually coming in from users that you don't normally interact with, users that are outside of your organization. Those type of things will, of course, bring in red flags. And that's what you can see here right on the screen. So you will be prompted with a text saying that you don't often interact with this user, or this email is coming from outside your organization, which means that the risk of it being a malicious email is much higher. You can also see when you hover over the links, you can see where the links lead you. And so you can detect whether this indeed is a malicious link or not. Now, how Microsoft can help you with all of that? Across all of the Zero Trust framework that we have been talking about, we see protection of identities and endpoints with the Zero Trust Foundation. This is what I mentioned as Azure Active Directory, for example, or the Endpoint Manager. We can also help with modernizing any security and defending against threats throughout your endpoints and throughout your environment, whether it's in the cloud through Defender for Cloud, or whether it's on-premise and on-premise devices, such as Defender for Endpoint. We can also help you with any data protection that you might need, so managing and investigating risks around your data, and of course, protecting and governing any sensitive data that you might have. All right, thanks for joining today. I'd like to also see if you might have any questions. And again, feel free to post any questions that you might have in the chat. If not, feel free to also let us know by email and send either your customer success managers or anyone from Microsoft that you interact with your questions. We would be happy to answer. Thank you.